Well, thank you, Alison. That's quite a challenge to follow all that. I'm going to begin by breaking a rule that was one of the big rules when I was first training for all this stuff back in the 20th century. And the rule was this, that whenever you preach a sermon or give a lecture or anything else, you never tell a story about yourself, okay? It was okay to tell stories about absolutely anything else, but never yourself. So I'm going to break that rule right from the start, because actually, if we don't know how to tell our own stories, we shall never connect with anyone who is spiritually searching. So come with me to a dinner party. This was happening in the city of Stirling, where at the time I was teaching religious studies in the university. And one of the local ministers wanted to introduce my wife Olive and myself to the leader, one of the national leaders of our Scottish denominations. So it was, I'm sure you've all been at these kinds of dinner parties, you know, where there were more knives and forks on the table than you knew what to do with, where the best china had been brought out and the fine tablecloths. And so we're sitting at the table, and this national leader said to me tentatively, as you would, "Tell me, John, what are you researching right now?" Now, it so happened that just not long before that, I had been to my first visit to California. I had been to the city of Berkeley, which is in the north of California, in the Bay Area around San Francisco, often referred to by the locals as Berkeley, because it was one of the centres of the counterculture of the 1960s. I'd actually been teaching a course in one of the many seminaries there, an intensive course, but that for me was only the way of getting myself to California to see what the so-called alternative spiritual scene might actually be. So I could have said to him, I was teaching this course to seminary students and this is what happened and this is what I said. But instead I said, no, I've been exploring these weird people who we at the moment, at that time, called New Agers. And I regaled him with stories of visits to more crystal shops than you could possibly have imagined, visits to a transpersonal psychologist who assured me that I was not whatever age I was at the time, but actually an old soul, 34,000 years old. And I also told him that as the icing on the cake, as it were, someone had managed to get me an interview with Shirley MacLaine, the Hollywood actress, who was big into spiritual exploration. Actually, there was a condition that accompanied my visit with Shirley MacLaine, because her story was that she had amazing spiritual experiences when immersed in hot springs. So the condition was, if you'll come and join me in a hot tub, then we can have a conversation. So you can imagine the honoured leader of a Scottish denomination being regaled with stories of what I did in a hot tub with Shirley MacLaine. Yeah, his imagination went exactly the same places as yours did, I'm sure. But then he looked at me, and I obviously hadn't given the right answer, had I? Because the right answer would have been, yes, I'm studying 3 Greek words in Romans chapter, I don't know, 7, something like that. So, of course, he did what often happens when there's a hiatus in these kinds of conversations. He looked around the table and he spied that my wife was sitting over there, and he turned his attention to her and asked her a question. It's more than my life's worth to tell you what that question was now. So you can use your imagination on that one as well. And ask her, I'm sure she'll tell you what it was if you buy her a few drinks in the bar or something like that. But you see, for me, this was where I ended up in life. This wasn't a completely new thing for me, because actually I remembered when I was a student, I was quite a good student, incidentally, and when I'd finished my undergraduate training, I had the opportunity to do a PhD, as you would. And I had 2 offers on the table. One was an offer from one of the Oxbridge universities with funding on the table, so that was quite an attractive proposition if I would go and study literally 3 Greek words in You've Got It. Okay? The other was an offer with no funding and find your own way to study ancient Gnosticism. And that's what I chose to do. Because even as an undergraduate, I'd been fascinated by this prospect of where St. Paul actually was operating, where his theology came from. Was he somebody who deduced it in a kind of rational, logical way from his previous understandings of the Hebrew Scriptures? Or was he somebody who went with the flow and the context so that he was indeed all things to all people? And that was the St. Paul that attracted me, partly because my tutor in the University of Aberdeen, where I was studying as an undergraduate, he had come from a ministry in India before he ended up in his latter years teaching people like me. And so he brought this notion with him from the Indian context, that context was really important in how we understand our own ancient scriptures as Christians, and also how we communicate with the wider community. So I went off to study Gnosticism. And sure enough, I got my PhD and I closed the book, as you would in those days. You don't get a book these days, of course, it's all online and in some virtual world. I still have the book, and I thought, that's it. John, you need to do something more ordinary now with the rest of your life. And over the horizon had actually come the University of Stirling, who invited me to teach the Bible there. Now, lucky for me, nobody had ever done that before in the University of Stirling. So I had a blank sheet, I'm not kidding you, I had a blank sheet, and the rest of the staff said, we don't know anything about this stuff, so you go and do what you want to do. So naturally, context came very natural to me. Not long after I'd arrived in Stirling, I had an invitation from people I'd basically never heard of. And that was a group called the Findhorn community, who are a spiritual community, a residential community on the Murrayfirth coast of Scotland. And I remember being invited by them to go one Saturday and tell them whatever it was I thought I knew by now about ancient Gnosticism. And I arrived there, and there must have been maybe, I don't know, maybe 30, maybe more people sitting round tables like you are today, eager to know what I was going to tell them about ancient Gnosticism. Except they didn't have blank sheets in front of them. They had the texts of various Gnostic Gospels, many of them in Coptic, because they were serious enough about understanding this stuff that they learned enough Coptic to be able to read them in their original languages. Now, if I tell you that at that time, there weren't many grammar books in Coptic, and the one that I'd used was in German. So you had to know German to start with before you could start to learn Coptic, which itself is a kind of combination of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs along with Greek, with a few other bits and pieces thrown in. So these people were serious spiritual searchers. They were looking for something. And I remember that I think those 2 episodes were my first introduction, if you like, to the reality that there are people out there who are searching for spiritual meaning in life and who are serious about it. They want to get to the bottom of things. Now, not everyone's like that. But one of the other things that happened round about that period, I'm probably talking about a 10-year period in my life over these 3 stories, was that my wife Olive was a chairperson in the children's hearing system in Scotland, which is the equivalent of family courts in other jurisdictions. And like many other groups who work together, they had a Christmas party. So naturally, they wanted people's partners to show up at this Christmas party. And so I did. I remember driving out into the Scottish countryside, maybe 20 or 30 miles from where we lived at the time, into a house that interestingly, had previously been a manse or a rectory of the local church, but which had been sold off along with the church, I think, and was now the home of the person who was the regional organiser of the children's hearing system. And like many parties where 50% of the people had never met any others, well, the host and hostess, they did their best to introduce us. So they went round in quite a mechanistic way, I have to say, round the group, and we all were expected to say something. And I could see this kind of snake introductions gradually coming closer and closer to me. And I remember thinking, now, John, just remember you're at a party. These people do not want to hear about religion. You know, it's a Christmas party. You know what's coming next, don't you? So I said as vaguely as I could, oh, I work in a university, because that's what they were interested in. Everybody else had talked about where they worked, what they did to make their lives meaningful and so on. So I remember quite distinctly going through these options in my head. I work in a university. That didn't satisfy them. First off, well, which university? That was easy. Then, which department do you work in? That became a bit more complicated because it introduced the word religion. Okay? So I knew by now I had to at least come clean up to that point. And so I did. And then the next question, from the hostess, no less, so this set the tone of the rest of the evening for me. She said, do you believe in God then? Just like that. And then the next question was, what about angels? What happens after you die? I mean, do you know anything about tarot cards? And on and on and on. You know what happens in a party where there are maybe 20 or 30 people there? You break up into small groups for the rest of the evening, and that's what happened to me. I was surrounded by probably half a dozen other people for the rest of this evening who actually asked me more and more questions of that sort. By the end of the evening, I was spiritually, what would the term be? Spirited out is what I was about to say, but you get the picture. There was nothing else left to say, or so I thought, till by, I think we were very, very late leaving this party. We were amongst the last few dregs of people at maybe 2 in the morning, and we're standing in this big open hallway in the centre of this house, and the hostess says, I need you to give me a blessing before I let you out of the front door. And that, for me, said to me at that point in my life, you're not bonkers, John. Yes, this is a calling that you've got, a ministry, if you like, that is authentic to who you are, is authentic to where people find themselves in the search for meaning in what was then the 20th century, and on, of course, into the 21st century. So that's some of the reasons that I'm standing here before you today. Actually, I was reminded of this just a few weeks ago, because as Alison has said, Olive and I are working in a church in Glasgow, in what supposedly is the trendiest bit of Glasgow, the West End, between student housing on the one hand, a student world on the one hand, and kind of high-end housing, bohemian characters hang out in the streets, absolutely tailor-made for addressing some of these questions. Our church is on the tourist trail because it has various historic, architectural and other kind of things about it. And one morning, just maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, a young man showed up, as people do randomly show up. And it so happened Olive and I were leading the service on the theme which was, what is church for the 21st century? And I'm not going to bore you by telling you what we said in answer to that, but the first point we made was that church is a place of mystery. And at the end of the service, this young fellow, who probably in his 20s, I imagine, came straight up to us and said, that's why I'm here. I'm looking for mystery. So it's not just back then, but he actually returned a few weeks later with more confidence to tell me a bit about what he was looking for. By then, of course, he'd gone off and he'd done the usual Google search. He'd got to Wikipedia and all the wonderful things that says about me, and he discovered I'd written a book on the tarot. So this time he was able to have a conversation. Well, how do you use the tarot? What is that about? Is that going to give me guidance for life or whatever? And he came back just, actually, was it last week, I think? Yeah, last week. He came back and he said, I'm reading more stuff, he said. This time he'd gone to a book I wrote on the New Testament, an introduction to the New Testament. He said, I'm about halfway through it. And more interesting was the fact that he said, and so are my flatmates who I live with. Wow. So can you imagine somebody in their 20s, who we find really, really difficult to connect with generally in churches, shows up, discovers mystery, where what he's looking for. Well, actually, I've no idea whether he discovered it, but that was a good starting point. Then conversation about the tarot. Now he's talking about the Bible. Ask me in a few months' time what is the outcome of that spiritual search, and I might be able to tell you something more about it. So let's move on from me then. That's enough about me, I think. That's more than I thought I was going to tell you about me, actually. But how about the theme of our conference? Well, I've been thinking about this long enough to know that one way this can go is we get lost in the semantics of what is spirituality, what is the sacred, what do we mean by transcendence, and all the rest of it. And I'm going to say up front that while these terms can often seem a bit woolly and imprecise, I think it's pretty clear what people generally are getting at. That when people say I'm looking for something spiritual, basically they're looking for whatever it is that's going to give meaning and purpose to life, something that's going to enhance our personal well-being, connect us with our own deepest relationships, with ourselves, with others, with the planet. And so the spiritual search is focused on whatever it is that contributes to human flourishing in a world that is becoming increasingly frightening. Now, like most things in life, the way we understand the terminology depends on who gets to define the boundaries. And so you see, I meet with quite a few church people who say, John, you're interested in alternative spirituality. Now that terminology highlights for me one of our real challenges if we're to connect in a life-giving way with the deepest needs of today's people. The reason being that talking of this as alternative implies and assumes that what we conventionally do in church is normative spirituality, and anything else is to a greater or lesser extent deviant or unacceptable in some kind of way. Now, of course, if we take the grand sweep of human history, Western history, over the last couple of thousand years, then no doubt this way of looking at things can be labelled as alternative. But if we ask more generally, what does the spirituality of our culture look like, then while there's enormous diversity, it's hard to avoid the reality that in the last half century or so, the centre ground's moved away from inherited institutions like the church, and insofar as there is a generic spirituality in Western culture, and that might be a question in itself, it's got more in common with what Christians regard as alternative than it does with any of our ecclesial traditions. And that doesn't matter whether you think you're conservative, liberal, middle of the road, whatever. In other words, the terms of the wider culture, it's people like us who are alternative. And that reality needs to inform our own thinking and practice. A book that's recently published is a book entitled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God by Justin Brierley. And this is how he describes people today. And I quote from him. He says, people are living in a world where religion has supposedly been debunked, but atheist materialism hasn't offered a replacement. They are distracted by technology, but left feeling hollow once the novelty wears off or addiction sets in. They are confused by the demands of fashioning their own identity when there's no pattern to follow and the rules keep changing. They are made anxious by a culture that demands ideological purity but extends no grace to those who fall short. They're exhausted by the search for a meaning they must invent and a purpose that seems to elude them. And then he concludes, people can only take so much. When I read that, I thought, yeah, that's a reasonable enough description of where we find ourselves. Of course, in a capitalist culture, many people see the answer to that in terms of amassing more possessions, without ever giving a thought for anything that might self-consciously be regarded as the spiritual. So let's not kid ourselves that everybody we're going to meet out there is searching for spirituality in the sense in which we're talking about it in this conference. However, recent research suggests that something like a third of the population of the UK is indeed self-consciously searching for that magical something, the spiritual, the sacred, the transcendent, and they're fishing in whatever pools they can find to discover anything that might sustain them. A typical mixture might include random ideas from established world faiths, mixed up with a vast range of therapies, ideologies, fashion icons, beliefs drawn from movies and video games, maybe with a sprinkling of insights from Native American or other indigenous traditions, alongside ancient Celtic or Norse mythologies, and basically millions of other things besides. Now, the glue that holds these apparently disparate elements together, and I'm sure this is going to be something that will come up repeatedly in our conversations, what is the glue that holds them all together? I think in my experience, I would say it's likely to be therapeutic practices, integrating concerns for personal well-being with the health of the planet. Some of these practices will only appeal to what I'll call hardcore spiritual searchers, like the people at Fintorn who I've already mentioned. But alongside this, there's the enormous popularity of things like psychic evenings, the enormous popularity of the tarot, and other informal venues like pubs, which typically offer the opportunity for more immediate spiritual gratification, with mediums offering messages from the next world. So let's move on and ask the question, why is all this happening and why is it happening now? Well, one of the people I met rather later in his life was a man called David Hay. And I think his answer to that question, why has this happened, would be pretty simple. He would say, well, it's somehow built into our human physiology. It's how we're made to be spiritual. He wrote a book called Something There, The Biology of the Human Spirit. Then there's the research of the late Edward Bailey, parallel with David Hay's research into what he called implicit religion. He reached a not dissimilar conclusion, though starting from a very different starting point. And then more recently, there's the work of scholars like Andrew Newberg on what he calls neurotheology, which is basically examining what goes on in your brains when you have what you would identify as spiritual experiences, and how does that connect with what typically we would regard as theology. Now, their conclusions are very diverse, to say the least, but the one thing on which I think all of them would agree is actually the title of David Hay's 2006 book, that there is something there, whatever that something might be. Now, to people like us, for whom spirituality has generally been the same thing as religious observance, getting a handle on all this can be quite disorientating, I think, because it's not a religion in the usual sense. If I was to go and ask any of the people I mentioned, what are your core beliefs? They would probably not have a clue what the question meant, let alone what the answer might be. Because belief is probably the wrong word. The priority is usually on practices to promote personal development, cosmic awareness, often actually with no interest whatsoever in whatever theoretical concepts may seem to be informing them. So it's no surprise that for many Christians, much popular spirituality is simply, it's a conversation we're not part of, and it's a conversation we don't have language to know how to be part of, and it can be at best maybe compared to wrestling with a jelly. So are we wasting our time doing what we're trying to do at this conference to understand it? I mean, should we just go with the flow, whatever that might be, accept that like many things in today's world, looking for rational explanations is a pointless exercise? Well, maybe. But I want to reflect on some of the reasons seem to be going on here as to why this is happening at this time. And I want to mention just three things that seem to me to be floating around. First is a kind of religious explanation, if you like. Beginning from the obvious fact that some significant strands in popular spirituality seem closely related to, if not identical with, major world religions, especially those connected with India, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, but also with a sprinkling, as I said earlier, of indigenous spiritualities from around the world. Now, a century ago, most Western people knew nothing of how the rest of the world lived and believed. But now, with globalization, so many world faiths are directly accessible that it's only natural we would take an interest in them, particularly at a time when Western people are finding gaps in their own historic spiritual traditions and non-Western worldviews seem better equipped to address, our relationship with the natural world being a very obvious one. It would be a mistake to assume, though, that this is the only religious stream. It's not just that we know more of more different religious traditions. It's not the only thing feeding into the gene pool of contemporary spirituality. There are certain strands in Western traditions that have surfaced from time to time that arguably swim in the same waters. So in the 1940s, for example, Aldous Huxley highlighted the persistence of what he called the perennial philosophy. Western mystical traditions like Gnosticism, Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Romanticism, Transcendentalism, and so on. And much of what we say today is a reinvention or reimagining of that underground Western spiritual tradition that does ultimately go back to the Greco-Roman world and Gnosticism, and whose worldview finds a sort of parallel in indigenous belief systems around the world. Now, for as long as the Christendom story was dominant, this was always going to be a minority interest. But the collapse of all that has created a space in which this marginalized Western tradition can be reimagined, fortified by the realization that it's not so weird after all, because other world cultures have explored the same kinds of territory. However, that's not the whole story. We can also look at the question, why is this happening and why is it now, from a perspective of the social sciences, related specifically and directly to the instability of life in today's world. As the old ways of doing things change and the new seems less certain and secure than what they're replacing. Now, there's no doubt, nobody here is going to argue, I think, that the rate of change has accelerated, not just in recent decades, but in recent months, actually. And things that once seemed set to last forever turn out to be transient in an ever-changing scene. More than that, the actual nature of change has changed. In the past, significant change tended to occur on a generational cycle. Those of us familiar with church life, just at the grassroots level, will know that in the past, you used to get a new liturgy or a new hymn book about every 20 years or so, because that's roughly when a generation moved on and things changed. Whereas today, change is not like that. It's unpredictable, it's discontinuous, it's sudden, and we literally do not know what's going to happen next week, never mind next year or 5 years' time. Wherever we look, the best we can hope for is a snapshot of how the world is right now. So the current level of liminality and insecurity threatens everything we thought we knew. So what more natural thing then to seek new ways of regaining at least some level of control, especially when that can be tailor-made for the individual through esoteric spiritual experiences, maybe backed up by a conspiracy theory or two, giving an explanation of what's going on. So here the spiritual search can present itself as here's an opportunity to take responsibility for your own life, often as a way of escaping exploitation and oppression by the systems we thought we could trust. Many of the most active movers and shakers in today's spiritual environment are people who've been damaged by their involvement with traditional religions of one sort or another, and who find themselves excluded by inherited institutional structures. So it's not difficult to describe what's going on by reference to the history of religions or a social analysis like that. But of course, behind it all, as the kind of sea in which all this floats, is an absolutely enormous and fundamental paradigm shift that's going on at the present moment. So it's not too extreme, I think, for me to suggest that we are literally at the end of a civilization at this point in history. It's a historic kairos moment that is liminal in every sense of that word. What went before has collapsed. It looks like it's still hanging on, but it has collapsed actually, and nobody knows what's going to come next, in which case there's all to play for. Back in 2008, Phyllis Tickle wrote a book called The Great Emergence, which at first was either ignored or was dismissed of the ramblings of an old woman because she was well in her 70s when she wrote it. But as time has gone on, the reality of her claim that a significant cultural change happens roughly every 500 years or so hasn't just gained traction, it's being hailed as really quite a prophetic insight. The dominant paradigm of the future, we have no idea what it's going to look like. It's still a work in process, which is why it looks incoherent, looks chaotic, and why it's quite easy to dismiss this and say, well, nothing's going to change because nobody knows what the change might bring. It seems undeniable to me that the culture and worldview of the last 500 years is in, at the very least, a state of very fundamental revision, but mostly terminal collapse. And the growing concern for a new spirituality is part of that. So, if this is anywhere near accurate, we shouldn't be surprised by the many different strands that seem to be being woven together to construct today's spiritual landscape, because many of the threads have absolutely nothing or very little in common with one another. They are not held together by a common ideology, but a shared perception of the nature of contemporary cultural change and the underlying belief that the way to navigate collapse in the global environment will be through a transformational shift in consciousness that, for better or worse, we call spirituality. Now, for people like me, and I guess most of you, who were brought up in a world where 2 + 2 always equaled 4, then this can be quite disconcerting. The fragmented nature of it all can be disorienting, it can be threatening. One way to think of it, if that's your question, might be through, if you're coming from a philosophical kind of perspective, how about Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblances as a way of understanding how apparently disparate elements can all belong on the same spectrum of belief and lifestyle? Or from a social science perspective, people talk about meta-networks or networks of networks, or a spin, a segmented polycentric integrated network, which again reflects the same kind of way of seeing how these things that seem to be so different can actually all belong to one another. Or more prosaically, I wonder if it's an example of that story of the elephant and the blind people, you know, where, except the difference was, and when that story was first told in India, the prince the king was also the storyteller. Today's search for the spiritual is exactly the same. It depends which bit you're holding as to what you think it is, except there's no obvious equivalent of the king who sees the truth and the big picture of everything that's going on. So, I want to mention briefly some of the things that are feeding into this, some of the dominant strands, if you like. I've been thinking about this for quite a long time, as Alison pointed out, and 20 years ago, maybe a bit more, I listed 4 different ingredients that at that time I thought were feeding into the spiritual search. And these 4 ingredients are still there today, so I'll just mention them briefly and then add a 5th one to them. The first one I called moving east. In other words, non-Western worldviews. The traditional worldviews of Eastern religions, Eastern Asia that is. An attractive, though I think superficial view, seems to think that, well, if it's Western ways of doing things that have created the mess that the world is now in, then presumably the way to resolve it will be to turn it upside down and move away from modern and Western things to ancient and Eastern insights, or at least insights that are not Western in the traditional sense. I suppose this goes back to the appearance of Swami Vivekananda at the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893. In that context, and because of his influence at the time, the East has generally been the Indian subcontinent, and therefore the spiritual pathways largely, not exclusively, but largely Hinduism and Buddhism, though of course understood through the perspective and categories of Western thinking, what Edward Said and others have called Orientalism. Now, this way of understanding them has conveniently enabled us to filter out the bits that we think are useful and filter out the bits that are a bit more challenging. So their ethical and lifestyle demands are largely marginalized, and in the case of Hinduism, we end up with a version of physical exercise with no other agendas or commitments. And in the case of Buddhism, it's come to be marketed as mindfulness. The word marketing is important here, as it's a significant part of what's going on. The commercialization of spiritual practices, that I will sell you what will help you to be a better person, features in some of the other sessions, so I'm not going to say much about it here. But there was a book published in 2019, I think was partly missed because COVID came over the horizon not long after that, a book by Ronald Purser called Mindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. I have to admit the only reason I read it was because it's used the term mindfulness, and I'd written a book myself on the impact of McDonaldization on the church. But the gist of his argument is quite simple. He calls it mindfulness a tool of self-discipline disguised as self-help. And he goes on to point out that, yes, for those of you who are into mindfulness, yes, it does work. Yes, it can alleviate stress, but it comes often in a packaging that implies the source of our stress is within us rather than the consequences of the neoliberal marketplace. In other words, its raison d'etre, he says, and I'm quoting from him, is not that the nature of the capitalist system is inherently problematic, rather it's the failure of individuals to be mindful and resilient in a precarious and uncertain economy. Then, somewhat cynically, he adds, then they sell us solutions that make us contented, mindful capitalists. Yeah, I thought some of you would like that. He's not the only one to identify this. Jeremy Corrett and Richard King had a similar argument in their earlier book called Selling Spirituality. So that's the first one about moving east, grabbing things from other traditions. The second category that I identified I called moving sideways, in other words, First Nation beliefs. Because, of course, long before Europeans settled in the Americas or Australasia, These lands and others like them were home to ancient nations whose environmentally friendly spiritualities were suppressed. Their spirituality was devalued by Western colonists who thought it was primitive, unscientific, etc., etc. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Western people could have learned a lot from the traditional lifestyles of indigenous peoples. I watched a television program just the other night on the Amazon, in which it was pointed out the significance of the indigenous understanding of so many of the plants that were there in relation to medicine that can address many of our medical challenges in the 21st century. In North America and Australia, this concern to rediscover indigenous spiritualities has become a major concern, and bookstores are bulging with books on topics related to them. Though, incidentally, the people whose insights are supposedly valued like this are still, for the most part, marginalised and exploited in everyday life. That's certainly true in Australia and North America. So is this another example of big business simply ransacking a spiritual tradition to make money? There's certainly that element to it, though I also recall conversations with Aboriginal people in Australia who simply pointed out to me that if my forebears had taken the time to listen to their stories of the dream time, they would have gone as Christians and would simply have told the stories of Jesus alongside the Dreamtime stories, and the people themselves would immediately have seen a connection between the two narratives. Whereas as it is, Christian faith was presented as a collection of doctrines, abstract ideas, which meant that virtually no Aboriginal people have ever had any meaningful connection with the churches. There are some exceptions, and I know some of them, but by and large that's true. And the same thing is true in North America, which highlights for me the primary role of storytelling as a way of exploring, understanding life, and that is fundamental to today's spiritual search. And I'll simply say there's a bit of an irony in the fact that Jesus told stories and asked questions, whereas much of the Christian world tends to prioritize theory, abstractions, and regards story as, at best, second best, if not something that you basically can't do anything with. In a recent seminar at Fuller Seminary, where Olive and I currently teach, amongst all the other things we do in life, we had a seminar with Martin Scorsese, the well-known Hollywood filmmaker. And this is what he said in talking about his Christian faith in relation to his movies. He said his approach, and I quote, was making people feel so much they can't help thinking. And I thought, yes, that's what I'm supposed to be doing in helping people to explore the spiritual and the meaning of life today. Making people feel so much that they can't help thinking. So for people like us who like thinking, it's not that thinking is being marginalised or devalued. It's just that I seem to remember Gustavo Gutierrez saying something quite similar, didn't he? Discipleship is the first act. Theology, that is thinking about it, is the second act. He said it so often that, you know, when I went to look for a reference to it, it's everywhere in all his books. Discipleship is the first, theology comes second. And of course, for some people, theology doesn't feature at all. And it doesn't need to, in that technical aspect of rational, extracted, abstract thinking. The third of my categories, and you'll be glad to know we are going to finish this in time for us to have some conversations around the table, but I wanted to give you a lot to think about here. Moving backwards was the third of my categories. In other words, a nature-focused spirituality. Because long before the spread of these so-called classical Western values, Greek philosophy, Christendom, etc., Europe itself was home to a different, more spiritual worldview, and certainly one that's grounded in appreciating our place in the natural world regarding that as a sacred space. So a significant strand of popular spirituality would say, well, maybe the answer to our questions is much closer than indigenous people in South America or North America or Australia or whatever. It's right in our own heritage. It's with the Celts in particular in these islands, but there are other comparable people groups in Northern Europe. And this concern amounts for the enormous interest in paganism in its many forms, which a recent news report from the census in Scotland that was carried out just a couple of years ago tells me that paganism is now the fourth biggest religious group in Scotland. We know that only because the Scottish census had a question, a box that you could tick if you were a pagan, which apparently the English and Welsh ones didn't. I haven't checked that out, but I'm sure that's correct. So long before, this is something that we cannot afford to ignore. Hence the popularity of transformational practices and therapies, which since the creation particularly of online resources like YouTube and the rest have multiplied exponentially in recent years. More interestingly is that some Christian theologians have got alongside this. So if I mention the name of Matthew Fox here, for example, I guess some of you at least will know who I'm talking about, who has viewed the Bible and indeed the Christian tradition not through the lens of the Western fall redemption paradigm, but through a creation-centered paradigm, which after all is the first page of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1. God sees it, and God's attitude is an attitude of blessing, not the attitude of cursing, which has come to dominate much Western thinking. He and others, Matthew Fox and others, have certainly built bridges between this mainstream Christian tradition and today's spiritual searchers, but I think I'm right in saying have never been the flavour of the month in ecclesiastical circles. He was thrown out of his original denomination, did indeed find a home somewhere else, but is still a kind of maverick out there. Then my fourth category was going within, person-centered spirituality, because many of those who today are searching for new ways of being have no interest at all in anything we might call religion, whether it's east, west, up, down, whatever it might happen to be. But the development of psychotherapies of various kinds, not least transpersonal psychology, is providing this kind of secular person access to the same sort of transformational experiences as mystical religious traditions offer, but without the baggage of any sort of religious dogma. Hence the popularity of actually some of the things that Anne and I are going to talk about later on. ASMR being one that's actually listed, I think, on the programme. Autosensory meridian response. If you don't know what that is, then I suggest between now and that session you idly put that into YouTube and your phone will be invaded by stuff that you probably wouldn't even dream existed out there. The fifth one I want to add is a slightly more amorphous set of influences coming from the world of astrophysics and reflected in popular thinking, in online gaming, sci-fi movies, all that sort of stuff, where the existence of alternative dimensions of reality is taken for granted and regularly regarded as the repository of all the secrets of the universe through the influences maybe of aliens who not only visit our planet, but give secret knowledge to those who listen to them that explains the inexplicable and empowers people who pay attention to them to become saviours of the world. I just took that sentence from the blurb about a particular video game. Today's physicists do, of course, talk in terms of multiple dimensions of reality. And the way that's utilised in the digital world might appear to us to be so obviously fictitious as not to be worth serious engagement. But there's one thing the online gaming environment does, along with computer-generated movies, and that is it blurs the lines between reality and fantasy. So whatever the motivation, it's undoubtedly become a significant influence in the world of conspiracy theorists, doomsday preppers, survivalists, all of those who believe that a new world order is coming and they know the secret to navigate it. Now, there's a crossover point here where the spiritual search can give prominence to leaders claiming to be in control of the future and who end up creating dangerous groups with a potential to damage followers, something that's by no means absent from recognized Christian circles. And I think that again will come up in one of our sessions. So finally, what are we going to do about it all? So I want to finish with some reflections on how Christians might effectively and purposefully engage with all this in a life-giving way that will bring blessing to ourselves as well as others who we might meet along the way. Before that, though, I want to just remind ourselves of the context we operate in. And the first thing is to remember that the components of today's spiritual search are not united by a single clearly articulated worldview or ideology, so there will be no simple one-size-fits-all fix. The thing that's common to them all is the conviction that our culture has lost its way, and we need to search wherever we can to find new ways of discovering ourselves again. And the key test of that is going to be practical effectiveness, not ideological consistency, which actually is a challenge, I think, to people like us, because it's the ideological that we've been trained and brought up and conditioned to think is the essential thing, and we've often marginalized practices. Of course, that doesn't mean we won't come across articulate individuals who can explain themselves, but it does mean they're more likely, as Scorsese said, to be moving from praxis to theory rather than the other way round. And it also means that what's true of individual pathways through which the search is directed won't necessarily be true of the whole. And then undergirding this, which I think is a particular challenge to what I'll call thinking Christians, if you know what I mean, is a notion that actually the mess we're in today is somehow a consequence of the West's love affair with rationality, and that that's somehow led to the marginalization of human and spiritual values, an unhealthy preoccupation with a mechanistic, rationalist, reductionist worldview, and to resolve the present crisis, we need to reverse all that. And then, of course, alongside this is this feeling that if there is a way out, then traditional Western sources of spiritual guidance are not going to be much help in finding it. And that, of course, includes the church. So, to put it bluntly, there is a stream out there that says if Christianity is part of the problem, it can't also be part of the solution. Doesn't mean we're despised or hated. In fact, most people admire the good that Christians and the church do. It just means, for me, that we need to earn the right to be heard, rather than assuming that we deserve to be taken seriously. Now, of course, these are all generalizations. But we need to bear in mind that in today's world, unlike yesterday's, we don't speak from a position of power, but a position of weakness. So what about mission? Alison introduced me by saying that I was co-chair actually, along with the Bishop of Lichfield, of the Mission Theology Apologetics group. And I, like Alison, have been with that group for rather a long time. I reckon 20 years. Anne will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I started in 2004 and we're now in 2024, which tells you actually something about the life-giving nature that can emerge out of what started as a church committee. Okay? I'd like to think it's down to the two chairs, to be honest with you, but others need to comment on that more appropriately. So, since about the 1930s, mission thinking, certainly with groups like our group anyway, and more widely, mission thinking has started from a notion that was first mentioned at a mission conference in 1932, I think it was, the notion of the Missio Dei, Latin words that obviously just mean the mission of God. In other words, the notion that mission isn't about me doing a good turn for an otherwise powerless God, but starts with what is God doing in the world, divine activity in the world, inviting us to recognize it and get alongside whatever God is doing. So what is God doing? Well, we could be here for another hour, probably another day, because actually as I look at the world, I see so many signs of what Jesus called the kingdom of God, what my old friend Ian Fraser, a theologian, Scottish theologian of an earlier generation, used to call just God's way of doing things, is how he defined that, which is better terminology probably than the kingdom idea. There's a lot of it, but I just want to single out one or two things here that might actually be within practical reach of everybody in this room. You remember, most of you I imagine, that Alistair Campbell famously said, "We don't do God." Well, it's clear to me that today some serious cultural trendsetters not only do God, but are also, interestingly, referencing the Christian scriptures in doing so. So if I mention the name of Jordan Peterson, does that mean anything to anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Jordan Peterson, for those of you who've never heard of him, is a Canadian psychologist. He's got an enormous following amongst young adults, especially young men, through podcasts and writings. And he's got a new book coming out in November, just in time for your Advent programs, okay? The book is called We Who Wrestle with God. And this is what the advanced publicity tells me about it. I'm quoting from this because it sounds so surreal, you probably think I'm making it up. This is what the advanced publicity says. Join Elijah as he discovers the voice of God in the dictates of his own conscience, and Jonah confronting hell itself in the belly of the whale because he failed to listen and act. Set yourself straight in intent, aim and purpose as you begin to more deeply understand the structure of your society and your soul. And then he goes on to say these and other stories he describes as, quote, the ancient foundational stories of the Western world. They are not just history, but can be a blueprint for a better tomorrow. And I tell you, he doesn't shy away from narratives like the Garden of Eden, Tower of Babel, the Flood, but he asks this question: what could such stories possibly mean? What force wrote and assembled them over the long centuries? Now, this isn't the first time that Jordan Peterson has expounded the Bible to his audiences, and I have to admit that I'm not too excited by some of the things he does with it, but I can't help thinking that, do we just talk a good talk about the Missio Dei, and actually this book and this kind of movement amongst young men in particular might just be it? Because there's certainly more interest in the Bible right now than has been the case for a number of years. I mentioned the young fellow in his 20s who showed up at our church and told me that he and his pals are halfway through reading what is quite a serious book. It was written for undergraduates in a university, for goodness sake, about the New Testament. And his mates, they've not showed up in church yet, but I'm pretty sure that someday they will come along and we'll have that conversation. But Jordan Peterson isn't the only one. Paul Kingsnorth, is that a name that means anything to anyone? He's a poet, environmental activist, started off life, as many do, as an atheist, then went to explore Buddhism, then into Wicca. Finally, in 2021, he landed on Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And like C.S. Lewis, he describes himself as a reluctant convert. This is what he says: I was never one of those people who thought the world was disenchanted. I always knew it was enchanted, but I didn't know what to do with that. And he goes on to say that contrary to those who dismiss the usefulness of meta-narrative, it's the big story of the gospel that's given meaning to his own everyday stories. I could mention A.N. Wilson, another one who's made the similar journey in recent years, Francis Spofford, And from a totally different space, Russell Brand. I mean, all of these are high-profile individuals with significant influence in their own circles. Is this the Missio Dei, inviting us to get alongside where God is at work, where God is asking questions, that's for sure. A few weeks ago, Olive and I found ourselves in Beverley in East Yorkshire, and we went into a bookshop because it was raining, actually. It was one of the best local independent bookshops we've been in for a very, very long time. And of course, being who we are, we went to look and see what was in the mind, body, spirit section. Now, 20 years ago, that section would have been dominated by books on angels, pyramids, channeling spirits, tarot, etc., etc. Today, here are some of the titles of the books. There wasn't a single book on angels. There wasn't a single book on channeling. There wasn't a single book on the tarot. There wasn't a single book on the secrets of the pyramids. But there was a book with the title, The Anxious Generation. There was another one, I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This, 18 Assurances on Grief. There was one titled The Wilderness Cure, Ancient Wisdom in a Modern World. Another one that I actually bought, Catherine May's book called Enchantment, Reawakening Wonder in an Exhausted Age. So as I looked at that, I thought this tells us where the agenda for many of today's people are. Alongside the pain and the suffering of the world and the insecurities of our own lives, we're all longing for a different story. Douglas Copeland, well-known Canadian novelist and artist, back in 1991, in a book entitled Generation X, wrote this. He said, "It's not healthy to live life as a succession of isolated little cool moments. Either our lives become stories or there's just no way to get through them." I think that sums up where so many people find themselves. It's not healthy to live as a succession of isolated little cool moments. Our lives need to become stories or we just can't get through them. Now, not long ago, I also came across a book from an entirely different source. This time, a rather conservative, evangelical Canadian theologian of the same generation, a man called Clark Pinnock, another Canadian as it happens. And in his book entitled Tracking the Maze, he writes this: "We should redefine heresy as something that ruins the story, and orthodoxy as theology that keeps the story alive and devises new ways of telling it." I thought that was insightful, if not prophetic, for him to have written from his starting point back in 1990. But placing those two statements alongside where we find ourselves today is motivating me to think that I need to begin with a human story, which is why I started by saying, if we are not prepared to tell our own stories, not in a self-conscious, pretentious kind of way, this is my story and yours needs to be the same, but unless we're prepared to be honest about our own spiritual search, our own spiritual experience, whatever it is, we are not going to connect with today's spiritual searchers. I need to begin with a human story, not to be afraid to tell the Jesus story, and to ask myself in the company of others, is there a story that makes sense of all our stories? And in doing that, here's something else that you'll be familiar with, but let's connect it. Maya Angelou wrote this, or said it, I'm not quite sure which. "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And that is a serious lesson that we as Christians need to learn. And then for a final, something to think about, almost to kind of up yours really, I think, from Tom Holland, another public figure who's rediscovering, re-exploring Christian faith. This might be the most challenging thing of the lot. He says, "I want mystery. I want weirdness. I want strangeness. That's exactly what I want. And now the sting in the tail. I want everything that by and large in its public manifestations churches often seem to be a bit embarrassed about. I'll just leave that there and you can think about it.